Karoline Leavitt took the stage and didn't hold back. With confidence and precision, she ripped into Ilhan Omar and the Democrats, exposing their hypocrisy and radical agenda. She called out their failed policies, highlighting how they've hurt hard-working Americans while pushing extreme narratives that divide the nation. Leavitt didn't mince words when addressing Omar's controversial statements and policies. She pointed out how Omar constantly criticizes the country that gave her freedom and opportunity. Instead of working to improve America, she spends her time tearing it down, Leavitt declared. And the Democrats? They just stand by and let it happen. She also tackled the left's weak stance on crime, open borders, and reckless spending. Democrats are more concerned about protecting criminals than law-abiding citizens, she argued, emphasizing how their soft-on-crime approach has led to chaos in major cities. The moment she exposed their failures, panic set in. The Democrats had no response, only weak excuses and deflections. The media tried to spin the narrative, but the damage was done. Leavitt made it clear, Americans are waking up, and they won't be fooled by the left's empty promises. She ended with a powerful message. It's time to put America first again. We need leaders who love this country, not ones who want to destroy it. The crowd erupted in applause as Leavitt walked off, leaving Democrats scrambling to do damage control. As the dust settled, the reactions from the left were predictable. Ilhan Omar and her allies rushed to social media, attempting to dismiss Karoline Leavitt's fiery takedown as misinformation and right-wing propaganda. But the truth was already out, and no amount of spin could erase the impact of Leavitt's words. Conservatives rallied behind her, praising her for saying what so many Americans were thinking. She wasn't afraid to expose the radical left's agenda, from their reckless spending that's driving inflation to their obsession with identity politics that divides rather than unites. Democrats don't want solutions, Leavitt said. They want control. The media tried to shift focus, attempting to paint Leavitt's speech as extreme, while conveniently ignoring Omar's long history of anti-American rhetoric. But Americans weren't buying it. Clips of Leavitt's speech spread like wildfire across social media, with millions sharing her words and calling for real leadership in Washington. Behind closed doors, Democrats were in full panic mode. They knew that voices like Leavitt's were resonating with voters. They knew that their policies were failing, and worst of all, they knew that they couldn't stop the momentum building against them. Leavitt's message was clear. Americans are fed up with radical policies, weak leadership, and politicians who put their own interests above the people they serve. The fight for the future of the country wasn't just beginning, it was already underway. And if the left thought they could silence her, they were in for a rude awakening. As the pressure mounted, Democrats scrambled for damage control. Liberal pundits on mainstream media networks attempted to discredit Karoline Leavitt, resorting to their usual playbook, labeling her dangerous and divisive. But their attacks only proved her point. The more they panicked, the clearer it became that Leavitt had struck a nerve. Meanwhile, Ilhan Omar avoided directly addressing Leavitt's criticisms. Instead, she played the victim, claiming she was being targeted for her views. But Americans saw through the act. This wasn't about identity or personal attacks. It was about accountability. Leavitt had exposed the hypocrisy, and no amount of deflection could erase that. Support for Leavitt grew stronger. Conservative leaders and voters alike praised her courage, calling her a rising star in the movement. "She's saying what needs to be said," one supporter tweeted. "We need more leaders like Karoline who aren't afraid to take on the radical left." Despite the media's attempts to bury the story, Leavitt's message kept spreading. Her speech became a rallying cry for Americans who were tired of the lies, the corruption, and the failed policies of the Democratic Party. The left wanted to silence her, but instead, they made her voice louder than ever. Leavitt wasn't backing down. "The American people deserve the truth," she declared. "And no matter how hard they try to stop us, we will never be silent." The momentum was building, and for the Democrats, the nightmare was just beginning. The backlash against the Democrats continued to escalate. Karoline Leavitt's words had ignited a movement, and there was no stopping it. Across the country, Conservatives rallied behind her, sharing clips of her speech, pushing back against the media's distortions, and demanding real leadership in Washington. Democrats, on the other hand, found themselves in a state of crisis. Their usual tactics, labeling opponents as extremists and playing the race or gender card, were falling flat. The American people weren't buying it anymore. They saw the reality of rising crime, skyrocketing inflation, and a border crisis spiraling out of control. Leavitt had called them out on all of it, and they had no real answers. Ilhan Omar tried to recover, making public statements about protecting democracy and combating hate. But her words rang hollow. Her track record spoke for itself. She had repeatedly criticized America, downplayed terrorist organizations, and pushed policies that weakened the country. Leavitt had exposed that truth, and the Democrats couldn't spin their way out of it. Meanwhile, conservative media couldn't get enough of Leavitt's takedown. She was invited onto major shows where she doubled down on her message. Democrats don't want to talk about their failures because they know they can't defend them, she said in one fiery interview. They are panicking because the American people are waking up. And it wasn't just talk. Leavitt's momentum translated into action. Grassroots conservatives began mobilizing, pushing back against the radical left's agenda, and preparing for the next election cycle. The message was clear. Americans were done with weak leadership, and they were ready to take their country back. As for the Democrats, they could only watch in fear as their narrative crumbled before their eyes. Leavitt had exposed them, and no amount of media spin or political theater could undo the damage. The movement had begun, and the left's grip on power was slipping faster than they ever imagined. As Karoline Leavitt's words continued to reverberate across the political landscape, the left's desperation grew. Their usual allies in the media tried to shift the conversation, but it was too late. The American people had heard the truth, loud and clear, and they weren't forgetting anytime soon. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, Democrat strategists launched attacks against Leavitt, digging through her past, twisting her words, and fabricating controversies. But none of it stuck. The more they tried to smear her, the stronger she became. Americans saw through their tactics. They recognized that these attacks weren't about truth, but about silencing a rising conservative force who dared to challenge the establishment. Yet, rallies and events across the country, Leavitt's name was met with thunderous applause. People admired her fearlessness, her unapologetic patriotism, and her refusal to back down in the face of political intimidation. "This is what leadership looks like," one supporter said at a packed event. "She's not afraid to call them out, and that's exactly what we need." Even moderate voters, frustrated with the failures of the Biden administration and the radical shift of the Democratic Party, started to take notice. Many had once believed the left's narrative, but after seeing the disastrous results of their policies, crime, inflation, and weakened national security, they were ready for change. And Leavitt was proving to be a powerful voice for that change. The Democrats, once so confident in their ability to control the conversation, now found themselves scrambling. They had underestimated Leavitt, thinking she was just another conservative voice they could dismiss. But they were wrong. She had exposed their hypocrisy, laid bare their failures, and ignited a movement that was only growing stronger. And as the next election cycle loomed, one thing was clear. Karoline Leavitt wasn't going anywhere. She had struck fear into the heart of the left, and no matter how hard they tried to stop her, the American people were standing with her. The panic in Washington was real, and for the Democrats, the reckoning had just begun. As the days passed, the panic within the Democratic Party only intensified. Karoline Leavitt had become more than just a rising conservative star. She was, now, a serious political force. Every attempt to discredit her only amplified her message, and every attack from the left further exposed their own desperation. Leavitt continued her media blitz, refusing to let the Democrats control the narrative. In interviews, she dismantled their talking points with facts, exposing how their policies had devastated the economy, weakened national security, and divided the country. They claim to fight for the middle class, she said in one viral segment. But their actions prove otherwise. Look around. Americans are struggling because of their reckless decisions. Meanwhile, Ilhan Omar and her allies doubled down, trying to rally their base by playing the victim. They accused Leavitt of spreading hateful rhetoric, but their arguments fell apart under scrutiny. Omar's past statements attacking America, defending radicals, and pushing far-left policies were well documented. And thanks to Leavitt's exposure, more Americans were paying attention to them than ever before. Across the country, conservative grassroots movements gained steam. Inspired by Leavitt's fearless approach, activists began organizing to take back local governments, school boards, and congressional seats. "We've been silent for too long," one supporter said at a rally. "Karoline has shown us that we don't have to be afraid to speak the truth." The energy was undeniable. The Democratic Party, once confident in its grip on power, suddenly found itself on the defensive. Poll numbers showed a shift. More independents were rejecting their policies, and once loyal Democratic voters were questioning their party's direction. Behind closed doors, Democrat strategists were in full crisis mode. Leavitt had done what few had managed. She had not only exposed their failures, but also inspired a movement ready to fight back. "If we don't shut her down now," one insider reportedly said, "she's going to be a real problem for us in the next election." But shutting her down wasn't going to be easy. Leavitt had something the Democrats lacked: authenticity, courage, and the backing of everyday Americans who were tired of being ignored. She wasn't just calling out the left's failures. She was giving people hope for a better future, and as 2024 approached, one thing was certain: this was just the beginning. The Democrats were panicked for a reason. Karoline Leavitt wasn't backing down, and neither were the millions of Americans standing with her. The fight for America's future had begun, and the left was running out of time. As election season heated up, Karoline Leavitt's influence only grew stronger. The Democrats, once dismissive of her impact, now saw her as a direct threat. Every speech she gave, every interview she dominated, and every rally she attended sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Her message was simple but powerful: America deserved better. She hammered home the failures of the left: inflation crushing working families, crime spiraling out of control, the border crisis worsening by the day, and a government more focused on appeasing radicals than serving its own citizens. And the people listened. Democratic leaders scrambled for a response. They trotted out the usual talking points, accusing Leavitt and other conservatives of fear-mongering and spreading misinformation. But the American people weren't falling for it anymore. The reality around them, the empty grocery store shelves, the rising gas prices, the crime in their neighborhoods, was more powerful than any media spin. Even moderate Democrats began distancing themselves from the party's leadership, recognizing that their extreme policies were becoming a liability. "We need to course correct," one Democrat strategist admitted behind closed doors. "If we keep pushing this radical agenda, we're going to lose everything." But Leavitt wasn't just exposing the left, she was inspiring the right. She called on conservatives to get involved, to stop complaining and start taking action. "We can't just talk about saving America, we have to fight for it," she declared to a roaring crowd. "It's time to take back our schools, our cities, our elections. The radical left doesn't own this country, we do." Grassroots conservatives responded in full force. Donations poured in. Volunteers mobilized. Local elections that once seemed unimportant became battlegrounds for the future of the nation. A red wave wasn't just possible, it was becoming inevitable. Meanwhile, Ilhan Omar and her allies were on defense. They struggled to contain the damage Leavitt had inflicted, desperately trying to reframe the narrative. Omar appeared on liberal networks calling Leavitt dangerous and accusing conservatives of trying to divide the country. But her words fell flat. The division was already there, and it wasn't conservatives who had created it. It was the failed policies of the left. As election night approached, the fear among Democrats was undeniable. Their carefully crafted media narratives were crumbling. Their base was unmotivated. And Karoline Leavitt? She was just getting started. The message was clear. America was waking up and the radical left was running out of time. The Democrats had panicked for a reason. Their grip on power was slipping, and Leavitt had proven that the fight for the nation's future was far from over. As election night drew closer, the tension within the Democratic Party reached a boiling point. Karoline Leavitt had become a symbol of the conservative movement's resurgence, and despite relentless attacks from the left, her momentum only grew stronger. Across the country, voters who had once felt disillusioned and unheard were rallying behind her message. She wasn't just exposing the failures of the Democrats, she was offering a vision of hope, strength, and true leadership. While liberal elites mocked her, everyday Americans, families, small business owners, veterans, and young conservatives saw her as a leader who actually understood their struggles. The media tried everything to stop her. Hit pieces flooded major news outlets, desperate to label her as extreme and dangerous. They twisted her words, took her statements out of context, and even attempted to manufacture scandals. But none of it worked. The more they attacked her, the more people realized just how terrified the establishment was of her influence. Ilhan Omar, one of the most vocal critics of Leavitt, was visibly frustrated. Her attempts to reframe the debate, to paint herself as the victim, were failing miserably. Every time she spoke, Leavitt and her supporters countered with undeniable facts: skyrocketing crime, economic decline, border chaos, and the radical policies that had caused it all. At rallies across the country, the energy was electric. The conservative base was more fired up than ever. Leavitt's speeches were filled with optimism and conviction. "This is our moment," she declared at a packed event just days before the election. The left thought they could silence us. They thought they could intimidate us. But they were wrong. We are louder. We are stronger. And we are taking this country back. Election day arrived and the Democrats braced for disaster. Reports from key battleground states showed record turnout among conservatives. Independent voters who had once leaned Democrat were now casting their ballots for change. Even some longtime Democratic strongholds were showing signs of slipping. The aftermath of the election was nothing short of a political earthquake. The Democrats, blindsided by the conservative surge, scrambled to regain their footing. Their allies in the media desperately tried to downplay the results, but the numbers didn't lie. Karoline Leavitt had helped usher in a wave of conservative victories, and Washington's political landscape was shifting. Ilhan Omar and her progressive allies were in full damage control mode. They blamed misinformation, voter suppression, and even conservative social media influencers for their losses. But the truth was clear. Americans were rejecting their radical policies. The left had overplayed its hand, pushing divisive narratives and policies that had led to skyrocketing crime, economic struggles, and a weakened global standing. Leavitt, on the other hand, was just getting started. While Democrats were licking their wounds, she was already preparing for the next battle. Interviews flooded in from major conservative media outlets, each one solidifying her as a leading voice for the movement. This wasn't just a victory, she declared on one of the highest-rated primetime shows. This was a message. The American people are done with the lies, the corruption, and the failures of the radical left. Her critics, now forced to acknowledge her growing influence, tried to regroup. Some Democrats urged their party to shift toward the center, recognizing that their progressive agenda was costing them elections. Others doubled down, refusing to admit that their policies were the problem. The divide within the Democratic Party was widening, and the panic among their leadership was obvious. Meanwhile, Leavitt wasted no time. She took her victory on the road, attending rallies, meeting with conservative grassroots organizations, and encouraging more Americans to get involved. "We're not stopping here," she told a crowd of thousands. "This is about taking back our country, community by community, election by election." The energy was undeniable. Leavitt had not only proven herself as a political force, but had also ignited a movement that the left could no longer ignore. The days of unchecked progressive dominance were coming to an end. The Democrats were panicking for a reason. Karoline Leavitt had arrived, and she wasn't going anywhere. And as she stood on stage looking out at the thousands of fired-up Americans cheering her name, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of something much bigger.